guess we'll start with questions.
Yeah, if you have a question, put your hand up. There'll be somebody with the mic that'll come to you,
Microphone over
and we'll
here.
take it from there. We'll start right at the top.
First of all, thank you all so much for making this film. It's very important. Some of the pushback that Sam and Majid have received, the question is whether Majid has the kind of credibility in the Muslim community that he would need to have successful reform. I'd say that he's amazing for reforming leftists of the kind that you described, but do you share the impression that he does lack credibility among Muslims? And do you think that if you would say that he does lack this credibility, do you think that undermines the effectiveness of the reform effort?
Yeah, no, great question. He does, and that should really worry us, because obviously he's one of the most reasonable people you've ever seen speak, right? So it's the fact that he's that controversial is a good barometer of just how deep the problem is. I mean, and it's something that I've increasingly begun to appreciate. I knew it to some degree when we started our collaboration, but you know, even as recently as my last podcast, I don't know if I did a podcast with Dia Khan, who's a fabulous Muslim filmmaker, but even she finds Majid radioactive enough that she can't really publicly align with him. And so it's a hard problem. I honestly don't know what
If I would just add, I keep answering this question in a way that you answered it perfectly. I keep saying, for me, this film, why I made it, is much more about the subtitle than the first word here. It's about having an opportunity to tolerant complicated world, which definitely is much more geared towards leftists or would-be rightists or people who are a bit confused about that. If that creates some kind of safe space for Muslims or ex-Muslims or questioning Muslims to find a space, and Majid could be some kind of conduit to that, that'd be great. But yes, I share Sam's view that we already get the pushback of like, yeah, try this with Muslims, or we get the pushback of like, show me a Muslim who follows Majid's kind of thinking here. And I'm yet to produce many of them, but I've produced quite a few people who've joined the waters of having this conversation in the West. I don't know if that's your thought.
I should also add that the problem, Majid gets it from both sides, because he's not here tonight because he can't get into the country. Right, so our finely calibrated immigration policy is keeping that Muslim out. So you can judge the wisdom of that.
If I could add one thing to this is, I had the luxury of working with Majid during a tour in Australia, and during the event we had with Majid, we actually had a lot of young people from the community, from the Muslim community, that actually came to the event. So he is getting through to the community. It may not be through the leaders that actually speak on behalf of the community, but there is a younger audience that actually is listening to him. They may not be the most vocal, but there is an audience, and I think, you know, in sort of the media landscape, he may have the sort of radioactive nature to him, but there is an audience that listens to his ideas and sort of listening to him. So I think he still plays a very important role in this conversation globally. We'll take another question. Yeah, still there.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks so much for coming and for putting together this film. I'm curious as to, I think a big obstacle, like a lot of us, all of us here are willing to risk our bodies filling these seats, and I'm pretty certain mostly, and I just mean you know, this is such a sensitive topic, and there's real danger to your career, as Sam is no stranger to, and so forth, that even if we're willing to sacrifice our relationships or our jobs or just having sensible, you know, specific discussions, that the deplatforming and that the targeted algorithms sort of deprioritizing, hiding, shadow banning, this sort of discussion, how is that something that we ought to combat from like the institutionalized regressive left, with like Patreon, deplatforming Carl Benjamin and anyone from, we're all subject to sort of the whims of the technology that we use to voice this discussion.
Yeah, it's another front in this war of ideas, and I think it will take numbers. It just can't be the few public figures who are out there who stick their foot in their mouth or seem to, and then get banned. This is obviously a much bigger issue than just this particular issue of criticizing Islam. It is on all of these topics where the left's response to speech is to stifle it. Now we know what the right, the asymmetry here, which people are slow to appreciate, is that the extreme right is a bunch of guys with tiki torches. Right? They don't have real power. And Trump is, Trump is neither extreme right nor extreme. He's extreme in all the ways, but he's not on that spectrum. But the extreme left has immense power in tech, in journalism, in academia, and in every university. So it's just, it's vitiated in the New York Times, right? It's vitiating Google, and these are the people who are tuning the algorithms and ensuring that people get kicked off Twitter or I could get kicked off Twitter for dozens of things I've said. I think it's just, now it would be controversial enough to kick me off that I feel reasonably safe, but it's just, it's just by sheer luck that I got to this level of prominence before we got to this point in this silencing campaign. It's, I think it'll probably get worse before it gets better, because it really is, I don't see a lot of wisdom kind of manning the barricades at the moment. But I just think we can't the crucial problem on the left is that there are people who are obviously not bigots, obviously not racist, and they're the opposite of that, who are having their reputations destroyed when they touch any of these third rails. And the people who are calling for their destruction and effecting their destruction simply don't care what their real motives are. That these magic words, that if you say that we're at war with Islam, as I wrote in my book, right? Well, that gets you on the Southern Poverty Law Center hate page, even if the surrounding sentences fully clarify what you actually mean, right? And so, as some of you, many of you probably know, Majid himself was listed as an anti-Muslim extremist by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Right? And successfully sued them for a $3 million settlement. The Southern Poverty Law Center is still this flagship organization for journalists everywhere to assess who is the extremist in the room. Right? They are who the New York Times goes to find out who's really a white supremacist. And I have landed on their hate watch page for podcast episodes, and it's completely nuts. And everyone is so cowed by the fear around the damage that's been done to their own reputation that there's not enough of a reaction. So again, the point I reiterated twice there was it really matters what the tweet stream looks like. It really matters what the comment thread looks like. People are getting fired over these things. You can have a #1 television show, and if the tweets go enough against you, you're off the air. Right? It's that simple. And so it really, don't think it's insignificant to add your voice to these conversations.
Anybody? Okay. There's a question down here.
Hey Sam, what was your reaction to Ajit winning the lawsuit? And also, so this would be two questions. Was there any point after 2016, say, where you guys thought you might not release the movie for being too controversial?
Did you actually think the movie was controversial? For what you just saw?
No, not at all. I mean,
I can take the last part first, because just so you get the timeline of a few things that are actually interesting to your question. One is, Majid was put on that list 2 days before we did that interview, so credit to him for actually, like, he was quite upset, and I kept pushing you and him to be like, okay, but their intentions are good, right? And it took a lot of gritting of the teeth for both of you to get there, especially him. And the other thing is we interviewed Sam, I think, 4 times for this film. There was 4 different settings, 3 of them on consecutive days, which were before Trump got elected, in the middle of the election. He got elected. We sent some emails back and forth, kind of negotiating, do we mention it? I don't think any of us ever considered not making the film, but we considered, do we even point at it directly? And Sam, I think you were like, let's just let that be like the silent undercurrent. And maybe we were unsure of how it would play out as well. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, well, I think I must have said that mentioning Trump in the film would have been a bad idea. 'Cause I just don't think any sentence with the word Trump in it is going to age very well. I mean, I don't want to watch anything or read anything 10 years from now that has that. I'm hoping we can all forget this moment in history. But, so it didn't have to be addressed, but it's your question about Majid. I thought it was fantastic that he won that settlement. The problem is it didn't exert enough pain on the organization, because they're sitting on something like a $500 million endowment, so they're just business as usual over there, I would imagine. But it is such a bankrupt organization morally, and yet it's, as of like 3 years ago, it was a totally necessary organization. It's this horrible paradox. We absolutely need people who are keeping an eye on white supremacists and nutty Christian militia groups. And that's a huge problem, and it could be a problem that will eclipse the topic of this movie once there's another Oklahoma City in this context. It'll be wall to wall what we care about. And the fact that the Southern Poverty Law Center can't get its head screwed on straight is really a great loss.
The mic, sorry.
Dr. Harris, there seems to be some discussions around the ex-Muslim communities in which the reformation of Islam is really considered a worthwhile endeavor. We see the effects of Christianity in the States, which largely argue that it's a reformed religion, but its doctrines residually still interfere with the teaching of evolution today or the research of stem cells. It almost doesn't seem to be an intellectually honest endeavor to reform a religion, the 3 Abrahamic religions, rather than tear them out by their edifice. Is there any kind of information as to whether or not the reformation of Islam is a more worthwhile endeavor than looking to remove the 3 Abrahamic religions from their privileged place in society? That just seems like a better approach.
Well, it's worth acknowledging that Christianity has effectively reformed almost everywhere. We're not dealing with the Christians of the Middle Ages anymore, for the most part. There are pockets. You can find groups. In Africa, you can find Christians who are hunting witches. I mean, there are moments still in Christianity where it's every bit as crazy as it's ever been. But generally speaking, even our own fundamentalists are not people who are wanting to kill people for thought crimes. I mean, they're not the theocrats that we used to know in the West. And that process, the problem is that process took a very long time. Right? It's not, we were burning witches for hundreds of years, and it took a collision with science and an emerging secular ethics that played out over generations. I think the recipe that Majid calls for is the right one, which is that you have to hold the line at secularism. So whatever your religious beliefs are, we have to get you to agree to keep them out of public policy. They can't be enshrined in law. You can be as crazy as you want to be behind closed doors, as long as you don't victimize other people and break the laws of the society in which you're living. And that allows for a fair amount of craziness. Right? You can really be a religious maniac and someone who just can't be assimilated in society for the most part. You can certainly be someone who, most corporations shouldn't want to hire, right, given what you believe. And that's a kind of a fine line to walk in our societies, given what our laws are. But as long as you keep it under wraps, that's secularism, right? And that would already be a huge gain in the Muslim world, in dozens of Muslim-majority countries, and in the Muslim community with respect to their aspirations in many Western societies. But it's a gain that we have made fundamentally with Christians, so progress is possible.
I want to add a defense that I use sometimes for Majid. I hear you loud and clear. I'm actually totally split on this subject. I don't know the best answer to your question. I hear Majid's plea in there. I don't know if it worked on you or not. And when he does the hands thing and gives his, he sort of laughs at himself and admits that this is sort of intellectually gymnastical, and that maybe you thought too gymnastical. Maybe not for a while. Maybe what's clear to me about Majid and his particular where he is I always say, he's told me that he's trying to be the voice that he didn't hear when he was 15. Just given sort of you rewind the beginning of that film where it's going through his life story, whatever state he was in, he didn't. If he would have heard someone like Sam, in his mind he doesn't think that would have worked. Maybe it would have. Sort of this a version of atheism or a version of this is all bullshit or whatever it is, versus what he did hear. But he didn't hear that reform voice that maybe allowed him to retain some of that identity, which clearly was important to him and felt under threat, but didn't send him all the way down the Hizb ut-Tahrir rabbit hole. So he's, in his mind, and I think we do that on some level all the time, he's trying to be what would have worked for him in his own sort of calculus. I don't know, I'm agnostic, so I support him as well, but also have no idea if it's going to work.
Great, we'll take a couple more questions.
Thank you.
Just in the middle, if you can get the mic to the lady in the right.
Going back to the earlier discussion, I'm interested in what you guys view as the most helpful for, regular folk who aren't being chased on Twitter. And it seems to me that one of the great causes of the difficulties in Europe is a lack of good assimilation, which we seem to do pretty well here. And what's your sense on how we might move that forward?
There are people who are better placed to speak to this than I am. I mean, we here, meaning America, we're lucky for at least two reasons, which seem fairly accidental. One is that we seem to have recruited, in terms of the immigrants who have come here, a sort of a different section of the Muslim community, and we're surrounded by two big oceans, and we don't. So the whole refugee crisis has more or less bypassed us. So we don't have the problem that they have in Western Europe. But the problem we do have is that the moment you travel even a step left of center politically, any concern about this sort of immigration, any acknowledgement that Europe has a problem on its hands, is tantamount to racism or bigotry. Right? You're branded. You're toxic for even worrying about that. And it goes to the nature of the first question. I mean, there virtually any, as far as I know now, any YouTube video where I just say what I said to someone like Douglas Murray, or he says it back to me, and so that's hosted on, let's say, your YouTube channel, that gets immediately demonetized, right? That the algorithm is saying this is essentially the conversation that can't be had. So we have our work cut out for us, because we managed to push ourselves back from a place where we can even talk about problems that should be just so obvious as to be unignorable. And you know, I mean, this is the kind of, you know, this film is certainly a very helpful thing to put out there, in my view. I'm very happy. It's been a long time since I've seen a cut of it. I'm just, yeah, it was very gratifying to see how fully it captured the conversation that Majid and I had. And so I just want to thank the two of you for having persisted. It took a long time, and it was really a grassroots effort.
I'll add to that. You saw like the ridiculously long Kickstarter backer list we have in the credits. We're super proud of a lot of things. I don't know if any of you guys are in here, but I will. I don't know. Hopefully the film helps. This maybe is a plug for us, but if there is anything to do, share the film, have the conversation, because I don't think it's controversial either. We've been making this film for a few years. We've been all talking about it being like, we tell people, you know, I tell friends and family what I'm working on, and they sort of cringe, like, oof, like, you're touching that. and now they see the film, and they're like, oh, it's fine. It's totally fine. It's like, I didn't need to be afraid of that.
I can tell you
Yeah.
that with some level of confidence, lots of people, first and foremost, they assume I am Muslim because I'm brown, and they comment online about the fact that, you know, that I shouldn't be touching this. And I'm originally from Sri Lanka. I spoke to a few media outlets over there, and they've already made up their mind about what this movie is going to be. So they, you know, we recently had an interesting interaction with Good Morning Joe.
It's called just Morning Joe.
Morning Joe. Sorry. and again, their point was, so, you know, which side are you on? So they assume that we picked a side, and the movie is, you know, taking a side per se. So any help to get the word out there to really show this is, we're not picking a side per se, right? We just have a conversation.
And I will say, we were I'm still surprised. Our PR group is great. The first media request we got to your answer was Morning Joe and MSNBC, which is not an outlet that I think would touch this a lot. Perhaps, I'm pleased with the film as well, but perhaps putting on sort of the cinematic veneer to this film, and, you know, they get a press release with our great distributor who's here, and sort of it has this legitimacy to it. There may be someone at that show who maybe wouldn't have in the past had this open conversation. It's like, oh, it's safe, like, we can do this. So hopefully the film helps in some regard, but I think there's ways to replicate that in our
Absolutely.
daily lives. And
Before we go to the next question, I'd like to invite somebody over, because she'll have a different perspective. You saw on the film Yasmin Mohammed. She's actually here in the audience. She's completely surprised. I can see her face. We didn't plan this, but I know she can give an answer that's slightly different to anything we can say. Yasmin, if you don't mind, would you mind?
He was one of the more qualified people I was thinking of
Yes.
when I declined to answer that question.
The ex-Muslim or for-Muslim question, she has thoughts, and I know she
Can we get a mic over there? If we could get a mic over there, Yasmin's just sitting.
And clap for her, because she's...
So,
Sorry to do this.
Sorry to do that.
sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sort of, how do we help?
How do we help?
Well, one, could you answer the question about the difference between North America and Europe, and how do you perceive the good luck of us not having precisely the same problem that Germany has or Holland has?
Yeah, I think the reasons that you gave are very true. You know, the two oceans help a lot, so you get to choose which immigrants are coming here. But I think a point that needs to be mentioned, which Majid touched on in the movie, when he talked about how when he was recruiting Hizb Tahrir people, he felt guilty that he was always telling them, you should not consider yourself British. You were born and raised here, you know, you went to school here, your friends are here, et cetera, but you are not British, you're a Muslim first. That's really important in this conversation when people are always asking, how can we make immigrants feel comfortable? How can we make sure that they're integrated and all that stuff? You're missing that element of, sometimes they don't want to be integrated. There's an active push from their communities to not integrate. So for myself, I went to Islamic schools in order to not mix with non-Muslims. And when the Islamic schools when there wasn't a grade for me, I wasn't allowed to, I had to go home for recess and lunch so that I didn't interact with non-Muslims. No non-Muslims were allowed to come to my house, that kind of thing. I wasn't allowed to go to their house. So there was nothing more that the society at large could have done if my family and my community were actively not wanting me to integrate into the society. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware, like, because people there tends to be a lot of white guilt all the time, of like, oh, what could we have done better? You know, well, how did we fail Majid? How did he became radicalized because of that horrible racist boy when he was 11 years old, and you just want to carry the guilt of that. But it's a two-way street. We're all human beings. There's good and bad of all, shades of skin color, and it's not, there are not two polar opposite sides of this conversation.
You blame hip-hop for much.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Oh my God. All right, we'll take a question over there. The gentleman, who has the mic?
I have the mic.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I was going to go a couple of rows behind you, but you've got the mic, but go for it.
Sorry. Anyway, thank you for the film. I thought it was excellent. Perhaps in your response you can tell us where they can be found and we can spread the word a little bit. A question for Sam. I'm curious, I've listened to your work and appreciate it very much, mostly through the podcast. And I was curious if you've ever made an attempt to get actual policymakers or people who hold office into the conversation. Is it that you're being turned down, or you don't feel it's worthwhile pursuing those type of guests?
I actually haven't pursued policymakers for the most part. But actually, there was an effort to get a senator of a non-identity politics style Democrat on my podcast recently, and that sort of fell through for reasons that weren't clear. But it was coming from their side, it wasn't coming from me. So I haven't really made an effort. I think I would. Well, I had one presidential candidate in a field of 1,000 Democratic candidates that we will soon hear about, Andrew Yang, on. But we didn't talk about this. We talked about universal basic income. I think I might do more of that. I think it's at the point where podcasts are sort of on the radar of people who want to have long-form conversations, even if they have political aspirations and know they can be lured into saying things that are not totally buttoned up. And that, I think the spell kind of broke when Mark Maron had Obama on his podcast. So I think that you'll see more of that, and I'll probably try to do that. But I haven't really seen the person who it was obvious I really needed to talk to. The only time I ever consciously made an effort in that area was during the campaign, when I saw that Hillary wasn't making any sense about the Orlando shooting. I just got on my blog and wrote the section of a speech I thought she should give on this topic, without any hope that it would, actually get to her brain. In fact, I had some sort of back channel knowledge that I knew people who could get it to her people, and it wasn't just public facing, me putting it on my blog. There were people, I was, 1 or 2 conversations away from people saying, listen, Hillary, you should read this, but nothing ever came of it.
The film will be available, actually I'll get the list so I can read out the whole thing. The film will be available through platforms such as iTunes, Amazon, Google Play, Vimeo, Xbox, Vudu, I don't know what that platform is, PlayStation, and all the cable networks in Canada and USA. So for a number of months it'll be available through all these platforms, and eventually it'll have a home wherever that is. We'll find out in about 3-4 months. So yeah, tweet about it, just talk about it. We'll take one last question. The gentleman who has the mic.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here and sharing this film. I've been listening to the conversation. I'm trying to think of the best way that I could sort of be helpful or add a new dimension to the conversation, because there's so much that I wanted to say that has already been covered. But I did want to sort of look at my opinion of the distinction between America and Europe in this regard. I feel that we can't overlook Majid's earlier experiences as a child, which he lists. They were my experiences too in the UK. And had I been Muslim, I might have been radicalized because I would have needed some form of protection, so to speak, or something that seemed to provide protection for me when I was being attacked by people jumping out of vans, neo-Nazi skinheads, and all of that. And I think that whilst I'm in agreement with the idea of not censoring liberals, I do think that there is a huge distinction to be made between the American way of dealing with tolerance versus the European. That distinction to me is simply that in Europe, we haven't had the benefit of years of affirmative action and all these sorts of things that have been put in place to allow people to understand that when you are being bigoted and when you are being violent to someone based on ethnicity, etc., it is not acceptable. And I tend to find this game that takes place with my European friends, English, French, etc., that is, it is acceptable to be as bigoted as you want to be in the public space, whereas it turns into a fringe game in America. And so I think that in the desire to have everybody just speak freely and say what you want to say, as much as I support that, which is why I'm torn, on the other hand, I understand how it plays out vis-a-vis white supremacy, anti-blackness, and all of that kind of conversation. It's a very different departure, but I just wanted to sort of introduce that to the conversation because I think it has real ramifications in terms of radicalization.
It's a great question. I am not a free speech absolutist, although I'm in support of free speech. And the simple thought experiment that I use for this is, if and it's gonna, I think it'll go to a place that gives maybe a satisfying answer. If you have a crowd in front of you that you've done the math and you know for a high degree of probability that they're very susceptible, let's say not very well educated and very susceptible to certain kinds of ideas presented to them, and you're an event planner or something, and someone wants to go up and talk about, a conspiracy of a pedophile ring in a pizza shop in Washington, D.C., just for example. And you have a large reason to believe that, let's just say half that audience will believe it, and half of that half will take it very seriously, and half of that half is likely to act upon it, and then half of that half, you're only down to like 3 or 4 people, but have weapons, and you have a lot of degree that you're putting real people in danger by allowing this speech to be given. That's a real moral quandary for someone who's a free speech absolutist. And we have to contend with that. Now, you can go too far and just stifle all free speech, which of course you're not advocating for. I hope and think the impetus for that situation, like any good moral dilemma, all of the answers are bad, and you try to design a world where you never end up in that moral dilemma. The impetus for that would be, let's try to create less and less of those audiences who are that, let's say, dumb or susceptible to those kind of ideas. I hope this kind of effort is to prime those audiences, that there's less and less people that are susceptible to patently absurd hate speech or racism of any kind, or bigoted, or philosophies of any kind, when inspected with a little bit of intellectual clarity, just fall apart. But you need an audience to be able to do a little bit of math and a little bit of 1 + 1 = 2. That's where I hope the effort is. But we don't live in that world as we are witnessing, and it's a real quandary. So it's going to be an ongoing conversation about this line between hate speech versus inciting violence. It's not something to just scoff at, and I run into too many audiences in this kind of conversation who just throw out this free speech absolutism as a great ideal, but aren't quite thinking of the math through. I don't know if you disagree with what I said there.
Well, I'm pretty close to an absolutist with respect to the law. Now, but obviously there should be consequences to saying something grotesquely stupid and divisive. They just don't have to be legal consequences, right? So if I got on this film and said, you know, obviously racist things, right? Now you know, presumably you would want to platform me, but even if you for some reason did, because you know you're just it's an expose on just what a bigot I am, well then I would, you know, in a just and tolerant society, with you know absolute political protection for free speech, I would still pay a consequence, right? I would, you know, people would boycott my business, whatever that happened to be, right? So it's not that you can't put your foot in your mouth so far as to destroy your life and have that all be illegal. And I think that's the situation we will always be in. But I think the protection for speech should be virtually absolute. You know, I think we have it pretty right in the United States, and it's pretty wrong in many countries in Europe. I mean, so to pass a law against Holocaust denial, for instance, you know, if ever there were a law that wasn't needed, it's that, right? I mean, the people who are denying the Holocaust, the fact that you've made it illegal hasn't made them somehow sane actors in your society behind closed doors. You have to deal with this creeping nonsense, and again, so much of this is happening online, and it's just always there to be absorbed, right? You can't get rid of these YouTube videos as much as YouTube tries. You know, they're jihadist videos up there. I went down some rabbit hole last night where I clicked on a video and was trying to figure out who someone was and followed them, you know, a few nodes, and all of a sudden I'm talking to, witnessing somebody talk to me who's just as well-coiffed a neo-Nazi as you could ever see, right? This is somebody who you would never recognize as an extremist of any kind until he opens his mouth, and it wasn't until like 5 minutes in that I realized I was in the presence of, you know, potentially our next Hitler. And it's alarming, but the antidote to that is not, it's that kind of bigotry and, you know, right-wing extremism is given immense power and leverage when the left and the mainstream conversation starts lying about what we all know to be true or should know to be true, right? And just lying about the plain meaning of words, lying about the real motives of people in various places, and lying about social problems that we have to figure out how to solve. And so political correctness isn't just a problem because it makes it difficult for well-intentioned people to write the books they want to write or give the talks they want to give. It's a problem because, again, as I said at some point in that film, we find ourselves in situations where it's quite possible that the most sensible voice, and in fact the only sensible voice that some young person is going to hear, is going to be coming from a neo-Nazi, right? And that's not the commercial for extremism we ever want anyone to be able to successfully run, and we're just de facto enabling that by silencing ourselves.
Well, thank you everyone. Really appreciate it.